Okay, so here we are, transcending the climate wars. And what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be defining the problem, the culture wars, and how they interfere with so much that's going on in our society, and particularly interfere with the climate problem, and to some extent feed the climate wars. Then I'll get us to think about how we are part of the problem, how we are all part of the war, and whether we want to be or not. I'll then talk about the truce that's coming about to some extent because of the COVID situation and the COVID crisis. And then I'll finish by exploring disarmament. How can we disarm ourselves and other people in this process, particularly when we're working with members of parliament and other people like that, other people that we're trying to influence. So that's what we're about. So the first thing to ask then is, what are the culture wars? And so my definition of that is that they're the polarized, tribalized divisions that occur in society over socio-political issues. And the most obvious division, I guess, is between progressive and conservative. That's the one that most affects us, particularly in the climate movement. But another divide is around, that people sometimes talk about, as the divide between communitarian and individualists. So those are two particular ones. But I think what I'd like to explore with you briefly is what are the sorts of issues that come up in the culture wars, and this will help us to flesh it out. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to type some of them as you call them out. So over to you. Let us know what you think. Let us know some of your thoughts about what are the issues that come up in our society, particularly around climate, that act to divide us, to make it harder for us to unite and to separate us into tribes.
Science denial.
Yep.
The cost of taking action.
Yeah, keep coming.
Victor's saying jobs dependent on the fossil industry.
What about that the free market is not absolutely perfect?
Urban-rural mindset.
Urban-rural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Vested interests.
Yeah.
Right.
Self-interest.
Keep them coming. One more.
There's one here.
Religious attitudes toward the end of the world.
Yeah. I'll just say religion, because religion's loaded with culture war stuff. Yeah. Next.
So there's two here, Rod. Absence of compromise and conservative conviction to ongoing growth.
I'll just say growth. Yeah, I won't use the compromise one. Any others?
Perceived lack of common ground. Sorry.
Lack of common ground.
Well, I think it's perceived rather than real.
Yeah. Yeah, that's yeah. So we'll get to that in a minute. Okay, so that's
Can I add that growth should be exponential growth?
No, I think just growth is enough for the moment, and you'll see what I mean in a minute. So moving to the next slide, I'll just share with you some of the ones that I came up with just before this talk. So the sorts of issues that people divide around, including the ones that you've mentioned, are tax. Tax is a very contentious issue. Welfare, in particular in recent years, about the New Start thing. Religion, we've mentioned. Things like marriage equality and abortion are really huge divisive issues. National security is a big one. And of course, we see that being used quite a bit recently. Nationalism is another one, and that kind of connects to patriotism as well. Inequality. Just the environment itself is a divisive issue, and of course climate is a divisive issue that the culture wars divide around. Immigration, of course, huge one. Refugees is a big one. Indigenous rights, land use. Those are the sorts of issues that come to my mind as part of the culture wars. So I'm delighted to have had your thoughts as well, and so I'll add those to my list later. So I'm glad I was able to record them. So these are the sorts of things that are, you know, constantly dividing and people are fighting about in politics, but also very importantly fighting about in the media and social media. And of course it's perfect fodder for the press to use, and particularly the less disreputable media are very happy to use those things as ways of dividing us. And of course sometimes it's deliberate manipulation, that the media deliberately uses these to manipulate for the benefit of a few. And what do the culture wars do? And the effect of the culture wars is that they effectively divide us, but very importantly, they distract us. They keep us fighting over this, that, and the other, and keep us from focusing on the main game, the main issues. It also corrupts us. It corrupts our society. It corrupts our politics. It corrupts us. It's very corrupting generally. It's also very confusing because we get drawn into these arguments and these discussions and get confused about it. And then, very importantly, it also generates an enormous amount of abuse, contempt, and hatred. And we hear this and we see this in the fighting that goes on in question time, but also on the social media, and particular in the with the shock jocks and some of the radio programs and of course some TV programs. Now, the question is, what is this all about? Why is this in place? Who's benefiting from this? And I think it's important to think about, well, a few people are benefiting from it, primarily the people who are already pretty wealthy, and it essentially supports the trickle-up economy. Don't know how aware you all are, but it's pretty clear to me that our economy is designed to trickle wealth up from the bottom to the top, so that you know, the very, very wealthy continue to get wealthier. And the culture war is a very effective way of ensuring that this trickle up continues. And then the other thing I'd like to just add here is to suggest that this is all part of the oppressive society. This is part of the way in which our society divides over so many different issues about race, gender, class, age, wealth, all these sorts of things that keep us divided and separated from each other. Very destructive issues. Now, quite a few people have gone into looking at some of this and why it happens, and looked at the two main divisions. And the two main divisions, as I mentioned, are conservative and progressive. And if you look at these three different areas, the first one on the left is the area, the concerns that are favoured by the progressives. Progressives are interested in equality, fairness, and care and protection from harm. Those are some of the key moral values and beliefs that have been identified as are identified with the progressive people. Conservatives are generally more concerned with loyalty, patriotism, respect for authority, and moral purity. And so what's important about this too is that on the third picture on the right is about identity, that it's not just about our values, that there also is a way in which we have quite strong identities around these issues. And so, for instance, I'm going to put my hand up and say I have a strong identity as a progressive, and that it's it's a very strong identity. It's one that I believe in quite strongly, but it's mine. It's personal. It's not necessarily anyone else's. And the best way to illustrate this, how this identity can affect us, is a Republican member of Congress, ex-member of Congress, Bob Inglis, who's very active now in the climate movement. He back in the 2005s, 2006s was a Republican senator, and he took the view that, well, climate change, well, if Al Gore is for it, so it must be bad, and I'm against it. And he admitted this in a speaking tour that he made in Australia last year. And so it kind of encapsulates this idea that, you know, once we have a fairly firm identity, it can very powerfully influence our beliefs and opinions, and that it's very hard to let them go. And Bob Inglis went on to talk about how the only way he changed was when his son told him that he had to change. That his son said, because he told him he was going to run for Congress again, and his son said, well, I'll back you, but you'll have to get smart about the environment first and about the climate. And so he looked at his own values and had to tear himself away from his own identity as a Republican. Another area of interest around the whole issue of identity and values is the Common Cause. Now, some of you will have heard of Common Cause. Common Cause have done a lot of really good work, and they based this chart on some very extensive work that was done across many different cultures to identify what are the key values in us across human cultures. And they found that across all human cultures, these values are kind of universal, that all humans have these values to some extent or other. In fact, the suggestion is that we all have all of these values, but that for some of us, some of those values are stronger than others. And so, for instance, some of us might be very, very strong on privacy, and others would be very, very strong on wealth. That's something that they value. So, what's interesting about this chart also is that roughly the top half of the chart are values that are considered intrinsic, which are focused on what's important to us as humans and as a community of humans, whereas the bottom ones are more to do with what's called extrinsic values. In other words, they're the values that more about, well, what do other people think about us, and how do we get on in the world. So I haven't made a good description of that, but I encourage you, if you're interested in exploring that values anymore, just Google Common Cause on your website, and you'll find some really interesting stuff about that. But what's important to that for me is that the message that we have all of these values to some extent or other, but that they're stronger in some of us and weaker in others, and that they change over time too. That one day we might have a very strong sense of equality, and the next day we might have a much weaker sense of equality according to what's happening in our lives. Now, the big question I want to ask, and this is the question that I've been looking at in myself recently, is am I part of the culture war? How do I contribute to the culture war? Is the culture war just something that other people are doing? Is the culture war just what's happening in the media? Is it just what's happening in the Murdoch press? Those sorts of things. So, oops, sorry, I've moved on. And so the best way I think it's useful for us to ask this question of ourselves. And one way to do that is to think about, well, what is your identity? And who are your tribe? And what are your core values? Just off the top of your head, what are your core values right now? But also, as a way of getting to thinking about who's the other tribe from you, think about who is the other tribe. And how do they annoy or infuriate you? What are the things that they say or do that make you furious or angry or disheartened or whatever negative feeling might come up? And the way I'd like to do this is to split you all into pairs. So I'm going to stop sharing for a minute, and I'm going to split you into pairs so that you can just to have a quick discussion with your partner. I'm going to set it for about I'm going to give you 6 minutes, so that's about 3 minutes each, and encourage you to just think about what are your values, what are your thoughts, and who is your tribe and what is your identity. Okay, so recently there's been a truce in the culture war to some extent, and that can be seen in this photograph of Morrison reaching across the table to Albanese. The Parliament has been a place of remarkable cooperation, and you know, the war has been suspended. There is a truce at the moment. And it's not just in Parliament, but to some extent in the media as well, and that, you know, across Australia and across the world, there are ways in which the culture war has been, if not suspended, at least reduced, and there are still elements of it going on, of course. And this is beautifully illustrated in this quote. Prime Minister Scott Morrison even thanked the Australian Council of Trade Union Secretary Sally McManus personally for the way she had engaged with government on the issue of the JobKeeper program. And he then went on to say, there are no blue teams or red teams, there are no more unions or bosses, there are just Australians now. That is all that matters. There's also been talk about Team Australia as a way of talking about the unity that we currently have. And we know that this unity is fairly fragile, that it's probably not going to last very long, but what I'm thinking is that let's enjoy it while it lasts, and let's figure out how we can leverage it, how we can make the most of it. So this takes me on to the theme of disarmament, and I think it's really clear that there's a way in which our methodology in CCL, which is based on respect, appreciation, and generosity, is one aspect of our values. Those are values that we attribute to other people and the way we treat each other and us and people that we meet with. But also another important value of the way CCL operates is that we're for, not against. In other words, we propose solutions, we talk about solutions rather than saying what we're against. Of course, we are against certain things, but like fossil fuel subsidies, for instance, but we find it more useful to talk about what we're for instance, a carbon fee and dividend. And something about those values are really important because they disarm. They disarm other people when we use those with people. When we carry those values, it disarms them. It makes it much easier for them to be with us. It bridges the divide between us. It helps us build connection, and it also helps us to establish the common interests and values that we might hold between each other. And that's really important. Those are some of the ways in which those are some of the things that attracted me initially to CCL, because I could see how important and how valuable they were in terms of building those relationships that are needed to create the political will for the livable world that we want. So I'm just going to touch on, I came across an article in The Guardian this morning, and I should say, I'll own up now, reading The Guardian is a very important part of my identity as a progressive. It's, you know, that's a real mark of me as a progressive. So this is a quote from Secretary General Antonio Guterres, and he was talking about the post-pandemic recovery. And he talked about these 6 goals, and it's just really interesting to look at the words that he uses and think about how they work with other people, how they might work with conservatives, for instance. The creation of clean, green jobs. Well, clean is probably okay, but because the conservative value is purity. But green is a red rag to many conservatives. The word green itself is very, very confronting. Taxpayer support, possibly not, but, because the conservatives generally prefer a lower tax base. Sustainable is also a bit of an off word for some conservatives. Grey concrete to green nature, I don't know how well that would go either. Investment in the future rather than the past with the end of fossil fuel subsidies, again, that's not going to appeal very well to conservatives. The next one is a good one in terms of appealing to conservative values, incorporation of climate risk into the financial system. And we can see now that companies and corporations are following this one very strongly, and that there's a lot of companies who are now recognizing climate risk and factoring for it in their planning. And international cooperation, probably not, because one of the conservative values tend towards nationalism and patriotism rather than cooperation, and we see this most clearly in President Trump. A couple more. Jan Rockstrom was quoted in the same article. So I hope that we come out of the pandemic with the recognition that science shows it's not worth taking the risk. So I think it's probably the word risk is quite a good one. And then Greta. Now it's sad to know this, but it's very clear that Greta doesn't go down well with most conservatives, and in fact we've seen some of the attacks on her, and it's actually, she clearly infuriates many people. And that as a recent survey by the World Wildlife Fund in Australia found that she only has a minority support generally in the Australian community. So it's really useful for us to know that. And so she's using the words like sustainable, and she's talking about destroying economies in a couple of weeks, and really scary stuff that would be really, really difficult for some conservatives to hear. So useful for us to be thinking about language as a key part of the culture war. And then the last thing I wanted to mention was, well, but they're doing this, that, and the other. Naturally, many of us from time to time will get angry, disgusted with the sorts of things that people are saying and doing to prevent climate change, and we would associate them with, and so we would in some ways join the culture war in the ways that we want to attack them and blame them, and another feeling that's likely to come up too is despair when we hear this sort of thing going on, and the ways in which the legitimate climate policy is being blocked over and over and over again by certain vested interests. So my message here is that it's really completely legitimate for us and for you and for me to have those feelings. But what's important is what we do with those feelings. Because if we take those feelings into a meeting with a conservative politician, for instance, it's not going to be very useful. It's going to alienate. So what's really important here is, and my recommendation is, that we express it elsewhere, that we find ways of expressing these feelings in a safe place with friends, with fellow CCL members, with people who family, if we like, so that we can sort of release some of those feelings, so that they're not part of our makeup when we're wanting to try and communicate with people from who we perceive to be the other side. Once we've expressed it, then we're in a better place to be able to think more clearly again. And by thinking clearly, I'm referring here to recognizing the common ground, the common values that we might have with whoever it is that we're trying to communicate with. To recognize the power of identity and tribe, and one of the things that's really important that I learned some time ago was that to ask someone to give up their tribe, to give up their identity to join you is a huge ask. It's like asking someone to commit suicide. Because our identities and our values are so, and our sense of belonging to a tribe can be very, very powerful. And nobody is going to let go of that easily without some really, really good reasons and some good connection with you to be able to believe that they can move over. And also, as we resume thinking, we can then think about what are the dangers of the way if we carry on those feelings, the danger of provoking other people. And this is the kicker, that when we provoke other people, or when people get annoyed with what we're saying, it actually entrenches their beliefs more strongly. And the same happens for those of us who identify as progressives, and that's me. When I hear, say, for instance, President Trump saying certain things, and it angers me, and particularly when he's talking about climate, there's a way in which that entrenches me as an opponent of his, and it entrenches and strengthens the climate war, which is not, and strengthens the culture war, which is ultimately not very useful. So I guess the key message here is that I'm suggesting that we take some time to process those feelings rather than let them swirl around and get in the way of our being able to communicate with other human beings. And then finally, my final point, and I make the same point in the blog that this is based on. When we next meet with members of Parliament or other people who we want to, particularly conservatives who we want to influence, it's really important, and particularly with the government, that we appreciate them for their collaborative and thoughtful adoption of the expert advice in terms of dealing with the COVID crisis. Because it is remarkable that they've been able to listen to scientific advice in a way that they weren't able to listen to around climate. So it's really important that we appreciate that, but also appreciate their ability to respond flexibly and constructively to crisis, because we know that there's another much bigger crisis coming, or it's already on its way, and that we want them to be able to respond to that as well, in a flexible way as well.